The day my father sued me was the day I learned that betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from the person whose approval you've spent your entire life chasing. I was standing in the lobby of the Parker Hope Foundation when my attorney called. The foundation was my life's work, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping burn survivors rebuild their lives. Every brick in the building, every program we offered, and every success story hanging on our walls represented years of sacrifice. My phone rang just as I was preparing for a fundraising event. Ethan, my attorney, Melissa Carter, said, her voice tense. "You need to sit down. My stomach tightened. What's wrong?" "There has been a lawsuit filed against you." I frowned. "A lawsuit? By whom?" There was a brief silence. "Your father." The words hit me harder than a punch. I laughed nervously, convinced I had heard her wrong. "My father, Richard Parker, personally filed the complaint this morning." The room suddenly felt smaller. "What is he accusing me of?" Melissa sighed. "He claims you've been stealing money from the foundation and using donor funds for personal expenses." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. The accusation wasn't just false, it was absurd. Every dollar that entered our foundation was documented. We underwent independent audits every year. Transparency was one of the principles I'd built the organization around. My father knew that, which made his actions even more shocking. "Why would he do this?" I whispered. "I don't know," Melissa replied, "but the media already has the story." I opened my laptop. The headlines were everywhere. Charity hero or con artist. Businessman sues son over millions in missing donations. Family war exposes alleged fraud. My hands trembled. Years of hard work were being destroyed in real time, and the person responsible was my own father. Growing up, Richard Parker had been larger than life. He owned businesses across the state and was admired by everyone who met him. At least from the outside. At home, things were different. Nothing I ever did seemed good enough. If I earned an A, he asked why it wasn't an A+. If I won an award, he asked why I hadn't won too. When I survived a devastating house fire at 10 years old, I thought maybe he'd finally appreciate having me alive. Instead, he treated the event like an inconvenience. The scars on my shoulder became a reminder not of survival, but of how little attention he paid to my pain. Years later, those scars inspired me to create the foundation. I wanted other survivors to have the support I never received. The organization grew faster than anyone expected. Thousands of families received assistance. Children received surgeries. Counseling programs expanded nationwide. People praised the foundation. They praised me. Looking back, maybe that's when my father began to resent me. For the first time in my life, I was succeeding without his help, and people noticed. 2 days after the lawsuit became public, donors started pulling their support. Corporate sponsors suspended partnerships. Volunteers called asking if the accusations were true. Some employees quietly resigned. The damage spread like wildfire. One evening, I sat alone in my office staring at a wall filled with photographs. Families we'd helped. Children who had survived impossible odds. People who trusted us. People who now doubted me. A knock interrupted my thoughts. Melissa entered carrying a thick folder. "The court date has been set," she said. I looked up when 3 weeks. I nodded slowly. Part of me still couldn't believe this was happening. My own father was willing to destroy everything I had built, not because I'd harmed him, not because I'd committed a crime, but because he couldn't stand seeing me succeed. Melissa placed the folder on my desk. "We're going to fight this." I stared at the legal documents. At the name printed across the top, Richard Parker vs. Ethan Parker, father against son, blood against blood. For years I had spent my life trying to earn my father's respect. Now I realized something heartbreaking. He had never wanted a son. He had wanted someone to stand beneath him, and the moment I stood beside him, he decided to tear me down. As the courthouse date approached, the media frenzy grew louder. What I didn't know was that inside that courtroom waited a woman whose past was connected to mine in a way neither my father nor I could imagine, and that connection would eventually change everything. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when I arrived for the first day of the trial. Camera flashes exploded from every direction. "Ethan, did you steal the money? Are the allegations true? Do you have a statement regarding your father's claims?" I kept my head down and followed Melissa through the crowd. 3 weeks earlier, I had been known as the founder of a respected charity. Now people looked at me like a criminal. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt just as hostile. My father sat across the room with his expensive legal team. His suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair neatly combed, and his expression completely calm. You would never guess he was accusing his own son of fraud. For a brief moment our eyes met. I searched his face for some sign of regret. There was none. He looked away as if I were a stranger. The judge entered the courtroom a few moments later. "All rise." Everyone stood. Judge Eleanor Hayes appeared to be in her late 50s. Her sharp eyes immediately commanded respect. She sat down and reviewed several documents before looking toward both legal teams. "Let's begin." The trial was underway. Over the next several days, my father's attorneys painted a devastating picture. They claimed I had secretly transferred foundation funds into personal accounts. They presented spreadsheets, bank statements, and financial records. To anyone unfamiliar with the details, the evidence looked convincing. Reporters filled the courtroom every day. Each evening, news channels repeated the accusations. The public's opinion turned against me even further. Meanwhile, Melissa worked tirelessly to expose inconsistencies in the documents. "There are signs of manipulation," she argued, "but proving it won't be easy." Every night I returned home exhausted. Sleep became nearly impossible. I kept asking myself the same question. Why? Why was my father doing this? The money wasn't the issue. He already had more wealth than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. No, this was personal. He wanted to destroy my reputation. And so far he was succeeding. On the 5th day of testimony, something unusual happened. Judge Hayes interrupted one of the witnesses. The witness was discussing the origins of my charity foundation. "You said Mr. Parker founded this organization because he survived a childhood fire," the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge leaned forward slightly. How old was he? 10 years old. A strange expression crossed her face. It disappeared almost immediately, but I noticed it. So did Melissa. Later during a break, she approached me. "Did you see that?" I nodded. The judge seemed interested. Very interested. Melissa replied. At the time, neither of us understood why. That night, I found myself thinking about the fire again. It had happened 22 years earlier. The memories remained vivid, the smell of smoke, the unbearable heat, the sound of wood collapsing around me. I remembered being trapped inside my bedroom while flames consumed the house, terrified, unable to breathe, certain I was going to die. Then someone had appeared through the smoke. A young woman. She couldn't have been much older than 20. Ignoring the danger, she rushed into the burning building and carried me outside. I never learned her name. Everything afterward was a blur of ambulances and hospitals. The woman disappeared before I could thank her. But she saved my life. Without her, there would have been no foundation, no charity, no future. Back in court the following morning, Melissa began dismantling parts of my father's case. Several financial experts testified that the documents presented by Richard's team contained suspicious irregularities. Dates didn't match, signatures appeared altered, records showed signs of editing. For the first time, cracks appeared in my father's story. Judge Hayes listened carefully. Her questions became increasingly detailed, especially whenever the conversation touched on my childhood. At one point, she asked me directly, "Mr. Parker, what inspired you to dedicate your life to burn survivors?" The courtroom fell silent. I swallowed. "The person who saved me never asked for recognition," I said. I spent years wondering why a stranger risked everything for me. Eventually, I decided the best way to honor that sacrifice was by helping others. For a moment, Judge Hayes simply stared at me. There was something unusual in her expression, almost emotional. Then she quickly looked down at her notes. "You may continue." I didn't understand her reaction, but something was clearly bothering her. And as the trial entered its second week, it became increasingly obvious that Judge Eleanor Hayes knew far more about my past than she was revealing. Neither my father nor his lawyers seemed to notice, but a storm was quietly building beneath the surface. And soon, a secret hidden beneath decades of ashes would bring everything crashing down. By the beginning of the second week, the trial had become a national story. News crews lined the courthouse entrance every morning. Commentators debated whether I was a dishonest charity founder or the victim of a family betrayal. My foundation's reputation hung by a thread, and my father seemed to enjoy every minute of it. Richard Parker entered the courtroom each day with the confidence of a man who believed victory was guaranteed. His lawyers smiled, his supporters filled several rows behind him. To them, the outcome was already decided. But they didn't know what Judge Eleanor Hayes had quietly discovered, and neither did I. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. One of my father's financial experts was on the witness stand. Melissa had spent hours questioning him about inconsistencies in the records. Finally, the witness admitted that he had never personally verified several of the documents. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. My father's confidence visibly weakened. Then Judge Hayes did something unexpected. She spoke. "Before we continue," she said, "I have a few questions regarding the plaintiff." Richard looked surprised. "Of course, Your Honor." The judge adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Parker, were you present during the house fire involving your son 22 years ago?" The question seemed completely unrelated to the fraud case. Even the attorneys looked confused. Richard hesitated. "Yes." Judge Hayes stared at him. "Were you inside the house?" "No." "Were you involved in the rescue?" "No." The judge nodded slowly. The courtroom had become completely silent. Then she asked another question. "Do you remember who saved your son's life?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. "No." The answer sounded cold, dismissive, as though the event had never mattered. I felt my stomach tighten. Something was happening, something important. Judge Hayes stood from her chair. For the first time since the trial began, emotion appeared on her face. She slowly rolled up the sleeve of her robe. Gasps echoed throughout the courtroom. Stretching across her forearm was a large burn scar. The skin was visibly damaged even after all these years. The judge looked directly at me. "Mr. Parker," she said softly, "do you remember the woman who carried you out of that burning house?" My heart nearly stopped. Every sound in the room seemed to disappear. I stared at the scar, then at her face. Suddenly, memories flooded back, the smoke, the flames, the terrified voice telling me I would be okay. The young woman risking her life to save a frightened little boy. Tears filled my eyes. "It was you," I whispered. Judge Hayes nodded. Yes. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to take notes. People whispered in disbelief. Even Melissa looked stunned. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Judge Hayes turned toward my father, and her expression hardened. I remember that night very clearly. She said, "Because I nearly died in that fire." The room fell silent again. Judge Hayes continued, "I was a volunteer firefighter. We received reports that a child was trapped inside the house." She paused. "When we arrived, your son was still inside." Her eyes locked onto Richard, "and you were standing safely outside." Richard's face turned pale. The judge wasn't finished. "I also remember hearing you argue with emergency responders about property damage while firefighters searched for your child." The courtroom gasped again. My chest tightened. I had never known that. Never. Judge Hayes continued speaking. "The boy survived because others chose courage over fear." Richard looked ready to collapse. For the first time during the entire trial, he appeared genuinely afraid. Then came the final blow. Judge Hayes revealed that independent investigators working with the court had completed an emergency review of the financial evidence. The results were devastating. Multiple documents submitted by Richard's legal team had been altered. Several signatures were forged. Key financial records had been manipulated before being presented to the court. Melissa smiled for the first time in weeks. My father's attorneys looked horrified. One of them immediately requested a recess. Judge Hayes denied it. "The court has seen sufficient evidence to question the credibility of the plaintiff's claims." Richard's entire case was collapsing. Years of lies were unraveling in a single afternoon. As reporters rushed to file breaking news updates, my father sat frozen in his chair. The powerful businessman who had tried to destroy me suddenly looked very small. But the biggest revelation was still coming. Because investigators had only begun tracing the forged documents, and what they were about to uncover wouldn't just end the lawsuit. It would expose crimes that could send Richard Parker to prison and finally give me the justice I had waited my entire life to receive. The morning after Judge Hayes revealed the truth, the atmosphere inside the courthouse was completely different. A week earlier, reporters had treated me like a criminal. Now they were chasing a different story. The respected businessman accusing his own son had been caught presenting forged evidence. My father arrived looking exhausted. The confidence that had once surrounded him was gone. His shoulders slumped, and dark circles hung beneath his eyes. For the first time in my life, Richard Parker looked defeated, but I felt no satisfaction watching him suffer. What I wanted wasn't revenge through pain. I wanted the truth, and finally, the truth was winning. The final hearing lasted only a few hours. Court-appointed investigators presented their findings. One expert after another confirmed the same conclusion. The financial records submitted against me had been altered. Email chains had been manipulated. Signatures had been forged. Several documents had originated from accounts linked directly to individuals working for Richard's private company. The evidence was overwhelming. My father couldn't explain it. Neither could his attorneys. Every attempt to defend the accusations fell apart under scrutiny. Then Judge Hayes delivered her ruling. The courtroom stood silent as she reviewed the final report. Finally, she looked up. "After reviewing all testimony and evidence, this court finds no proof whatsoever that Ethan Parker misused foundation funds." Relief flooded through me. Months of fear, humiliation, and sleepless nights seemed to lift from my shoulders. Judge Hayes continued, "The court further finds substantial evidence that false documents were knowingly presented in an attempt to damage the defendant's reputation." A murmur spread through the room. My father lowered his head. "The lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice." Just like that, it was over. The case that had nearly destroyed my life collapsed completely. but the consequences for Richard Parker were only beginning. Within hours, news outlets across the country published updated headlines. Charity founder cleared of all allegations, business tycoon accused of submitting forged evidence, father's case against son falls apart. The public reaction was swift. People who had doubted me began apologizing, sponsors returned, donors who had paused contributions renewed their support. Many gave even larger amounts than before. The foundation's website received thousands of messages from people offering encouragement. For the first time since the lawsuit began, I felt hopeful. The organization would survive. In fact, it might emerge stronger than ever. A month later, federal authorities announced investigations into several financial activities connected to my father's businesses. Board members resigned, investors withdrew, business partners distanced themselves. The reputation Richard had spent decades building disappeared almost overnight. Ironically, the destruction he had planned for me became his own downfall. Yet I still couldn't bring myself to hate him. He was my father, the man who should have protected me, the man whose approval I had chased for most of my life. That wound would never fully heal, but I no longer needed his validation. I had finally learned my worth wasn't determined by him. Several months later, the Parker Hope Foundation celebrated its largest achievement yet. Using new donations received after the trial, we opened a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center for burn survivors. The facility would provide surgeries, therapy, counseling, and housing support for families in need. Hundreds of guests attended the grand opening. Among them was Judge Eleanor Hayes, the woman who had once rushed into a burning house to save a frightened 10-year-old boy. As she walked through the building, I stopped her near the entrance. A plaque hung on the wall. She read it silently. The Eleanor Hayes Recovery Center. The judge's eyes filled with tears. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. "Yes," I replied, "I did. For years I had wondered how to repay the stranger who saved my life. Now I finally had the chance." That evening, as families toured the new facility, I stood outside watching the sunset. The journey had been painful. My father had betrayed me. He had tried to destroy everything I loved, but in the end, his lies couldn't survive the truth. The greatest revenge wasn't watching him lose. It was building something so meaningful that his hatred could never destroy it. Behind me, children laughed in the rehabilitation garden. Families smiled. Lives were changing. And as I looked at the center bearing Judge Hayes's name, I realized something powerful. The fire that nearly killed me as a child had eventually become the spark that helped thousands of others heal. Truth had won, love had endured, and my sweetest revenge was living a life my father's betrayal could never take away.